Renegades by Marissa Meyer. Chapter 5. Adrian was becoming anxious, though he wasn't sure why. Thunderbird had been brought to headquarters hours ago to be treated for her injuries, but the rest of the council still wasn't back. He would have known by now if they were hurt, so that wasn't it. Maybe he was curious if they'd heard about the Sentinel, what they thought, if they were able to see right through him. He spent some time making his way around the medical wing, checking in on others who had been hurt in the fight against the puppeteer before heading upstairs to visit Max, who was probably feeling cut off from all the activity, like usual. Max's quarantine was built into a sky bridge that extended over the main floor of the lobby. It was quite possibly the fanciest room in the place, practically a luxury suite, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the river, and a private quarters tucked out of sight with a master bedroom and bathroom complete with a soaking tub, though Adrian had the feeling Max didn't use it all that often. Max didn't seem to spend much time back there at all. He was always out in the main space of his enclosure, always working on the glass city he'd been painstakingly constructing over the last 4 years. When Adrian approached the quarantine, he spotted Max sitting cross-legged inside his model city park, one of the few spots of empty floor he could comfortably sit down on anymore. His eyes were glued to the screens outside his enclosure, watching the footage from the parade. His fingers were toying with one of the low-glass figurines Adrian had made years ago, a horse-drawn carriage like those that took tourists through the park. It had started as a game. Max was still a toddler when the quarantine was built for him, and Adrian was determined to try and make him feel as comfortable as possible. He'd seen how Max loved building with a set of interlocking blocks the captain brought for him, so he started making blocks himself, using his marker to draw new designs into the glass and pushing them through to Max's side. As he got older, Max started making requests. He wanted blocks that mimicked tall spires and domed ceilings, or cables he could use to construct a bridge. Before Adrian realized what the kid was trying to accomplish, he saw the familiar skyline evolving before his eyes. Max was 10 years old now, and the miniature city was mostly complete. It was a marvel, taking up the entire floor of the circular room. A nearly exact replica of Gatlin, created entirely of shimmering clear glass. But just like the real city, it was always changing, being torn down, rebuilt, edited, and refined as the kid worked to make it authentic to the real Gatlin, a city he could only imagine being a part of. Max caught sight of Adrian approaching and held up a pad of paper for Adrian to see. He had done his best to draw the council's parade float. "Can you make that?" Max said, his voice muffled by the glass. "What? No hello? No glad to see you weren't killed by a psychotic villain today?" Max lowered the sketch pad. "Reports have been circulating all afternoon. Well, with most of the focus on Thunderbird, though I know Monarch and a few others also sustained injuries. The news is also providing updated reports on civilian casualties every few minutes." He paused before adding for clarity's sake, "Obviously, I would have known if you were hurt." Adrian grunted and lowered himself to the floor. "In that case, yeah, sure, I can make that, but the cloud's not going to have actual lightning coming out of it. You'll just have to use your imagination. You want some street food vendors too?" Max's eyes lit up. "Yeah, and the villain float? And the marching band?" "What do I look like, a figurine factory?" He took out his marker and began to sketch the float, making it as detailed as he could recall from memory, though he'd been distracted when it had first come into view, caught up in trying to fix that girl's bracelet. He paused, the float half finished. With everything that had come after, he'd nearly forgotten about the girl and the way she'd look at Adrian when he'd fixed the clasp. Not like his handiwork was the most amazing thing she'd ever seen in her life, but like she was trying to figure out if this was a con artist's trick she needed to be wary of. Maybe there were too many prodigies floating into the city these days. The novelty of seeing someone with superpowers must be wearing off. He finished drawing the float, adding wheels beneath it so Max could push it around the streets if he wanted to. Here you go," he said, pressing his hand against the drawing and forcing his will into the glass. The drawing emerged on Max's side of the window, a crystal-clear replica of the parade float, complete with rotating wheels. The glass wall itself was left unchanged, the drawing wiped clean in the transition. Max held his hand out, his face tensing in concentration. The miniature float began to tremble, then lifted and hovered in the air. It bobbed slowly but steadily through the city, along Rakes Avenue, around the corner onto Parkway, before clunking down beside him. He exhaled and opened his eyes. "Thanks." "I think you're getting stronger," said Adrian. The That was steadier than usual, I'm pretty sure at least. No, I'm not, said Max in a matter-of-fact tone that would have disguised his disappointment from just about anyone else. Well, some telekinesis is better than none, right? Adrian scratched his temple with the capped end of the marker. Did you want the figurines of the council to go on top? Max shook his head. I still have the ones you made last year. He glanced around. Somewhere. His expression darkened as he turned back to Adrian. Did someone really try to assassinate the captain? Adrian hesitated, but there was no reason to keep Max from the truth. He was a smart kid and too observant for his own good. He watched the news more than he ever watched movies or cartoons, and even being stuck in this glass prison, he always seemed to know more about what was happening in the world than Adrian did. Yeah, he said, a villain who goes by Nightmare. You fought her before. Not me. Oscar and others had a run-in with her a few months back, and some of the other teams have seen her before too. Why would she want to hurt the council? Adrian started doodling marching band characters onto the glass, a drummer and a tuba player, a whole line of trombones. Some people liked the way things were before the Renegades took over. Back when everyone was always stealing things and stabbing each other? I don't get it either. But I guess the people in power back then would have been living pretty good, right? His brow knit together as he tried to picture the intricate coils on a French horn. Giving up, he gave the musician a trumpet and said, Do you think this new guy wants that too? To give the city back to the villains? New guy? Max pointed at the screen. Adrian followed the look and a chill swept down his spine. The news was showing a photo of the Sentinel. It was a grainy image of him lobbing himself between rooftops, taken from the ground 100 feet below. Captured in that moment, it almost looked like he was flying. Though the picture quality was terrible, it was the first time he'd seen himself in the suit. It was both eerie and comforting. There was no way to tell it was him. There couldn't be. No one had to know that he was the one who had failed to catch Nightmare. He was the one who had hurt Monarch. I don't think... Adrian hesitated. We don't know that he's a villain. He might have been trying to help. He fought Nightmare, and they say he wears an R on his chest. But he's not one of us, is he? Adrian started pushing the marching band through to Max, one musician at a time. I don't know. Oscar thinks maybe he's some secret weapon they've been developing upstairs. A commotion on the main floor drew Adrian's attention to the bright entryway. The council had finally returned, dragging the puppeteer between them, wrapped in chromium chains. The captain pushed the villain off to one of the waiting teams, giving orders for him to be taken up to the prison block. Tsunami went with them, holding a wall of water at the ready. Should Winston Pratt try anything, he seemed to be in too much giddy awe of being inside Renegade headquarters to formulate an attack, though. Blacklight slapped both the captain and his dread warden on their backs, and even from up here, Adrian could hear his boisterous voice saying something about Thunderbird, as he too made his way toward the elevators. Adrian stood. Captain Chromium glanced up toward him, and his face softened, perhaps with relief, though there hadn't been much reason for him to be concerned. As far as he knew, as far as anyone knew, Adrian had been down in the crowd watching the parade the whole time, and he could hold his own against a handful of brainwashed kids. Still, he couldn't help but smile back as he lifted one hand in a welcome-back salute. He turned and knocked twice on Max's window. Max waved goodbye without looking up, already organizing the band in front of the parade float. Adrian made his way to the ground floor. The captain weaved through the crowd that had gathered around him, everyone shouting questions about the attempted assassination. The puppeteer, Nightmare, the Sentinel, but they all went ignored. The captain met Adrian at the bottom of the steps and wrapped him in a quick hug before pulling away and gripping Adrian's shoulders. Adrian grimaced as he felt his stitches pull against the wound, but did his best to cover it with a smile. We weren't sure if you were at the parade when it started, said Captain Chromium. The Dread Warden appeared beside them and gave Adrian a sideways embrace. We're glad you made it back safely. To the world, they were Hugh Everhart and Simon Westwood. Superheroes, councilmen, founding members of the Renegades. But to Adrian, they were mostly just his dads. He rolled his eyes toward the ceiling. Knock it off. You guys are embarrassing me. Not for the last time, I'm sure, said Simon. Were you involved in the fight? Adrian shook his head. I was a few blocks away when it started, spent most of my time playing traffic controller to a few busloads of children. It's a tough job, said Hugh, but someone has to do it. Has an investigation started yet? Asked Adrian. The puppeteer wasn't acting alone. More anarchists might have been there too, and Nightmare was on the rooftops. He frowned at Hugh. She was after you. I'm fine, said Hugh, scratching his temple. Adrian knew that's where the dart had struck him, but there wasn't even a mark. I can see that, he said, but still, she tried to assassinate you today, and she almost succeeded, and she took down Thunderbird. This girl, she keeps cropping up, and I really don't think she's working alone. Neither do we, said Simon. We're looking into it, but so far there's no solid evidence that Nightmare is with anarchists or any other gang affiliation, new or old. She could have just gotten lucky to be able to use Winston's balloon for a convenient getaway, and without evidence, Adrian muttered dully. It's against code to go after them. If we don't mind the rules, then we'll be just like them, said Hugh. Adrian didn't respond. Back when the Renegades had first formed, they didn't have to play by any rules. There were no rules to play by. They were more like vigilantes than law officers, and they certainly weren't lawmakers. They did what needed to be done in order to make the world a better, safer place, even if that meant blackmailing someone for information or infiltrating a hideout because they thought there was something suspicious going on, with or without hard evidence. There were days when Adrian thought things would be better that way, when superheroes were left to be superheroes, not leaders. Maybe that's why the idea of the Sentinel had appealed to him. There was a freedom in anonymity. There was a power in not having to answer to anyone. Except, as today had shown, that didn't mean there weren't consequences. Try not to worry so much, said Simon, and Adrian realized he'd been scowling. We had Nightmare's weapons sent over earlier for examination. We'll see if it turns up anything useful. She's just a newbie villain, trying to earn herself some credibility, added Hugh. We've handled a lot worse. Adrian couldn't argue with that. They'd taken down Ace Anarchy himself, among countless others. Still, something told him that Nightmare wasn't to be ignored. As far as he knew, that dart had come closer to killing Captain Chromium than anything had before. Simon looked up at the wall screens, flashing between images of the puppeteer, Nightmare waving from the basket of the hot air balloon, and every once in a while, the Sentinel. Hugh followed Simon's gaze, frowning at the image of the armored prodigy. Speaking of investigations, what do we know about him? Though they were surrounded by reporters, assistants, and patrol teams, no one answered. Adrian scratched his chest where the zipper tattoo was hidden, where the Sentinel was tucked safely away. My team saw him when they were facing off against Nightmare. The Sentinel was after her, too. Hugh glanced at him. Did they see him use any abilities? I think so, yeah, he swallowed. Oscar thought maybe he's a product out of research and development. Would be news to me, Simon muttered. I'll talk to Oscar and Ruby, see what we can figure out. Sudden clarity entered his eyes. I heard about Dana. Is she all right? Adrian stiffened. He could still feel the warmth of his own fire, could still see those butterflies blackening and disintegrating before his eyes. The healers say she will be. Simon squeezed Adrian's shoulder, and he knew it was meant to be fatherly and comforting. But something about it made him feel worse, not only about Dana, but also because he had already decided he couldn't tell them that he was a Sentinel. Not yet. Hugh turned away, facing the crowd. Listen up, he said in that deep, heroic voice that could have made an earthworm stand at attention. If anyone knows anything about this prodigy who calls himself the Sentinel, bring that information to the council. As far as we know, he isn't one of us. He paused, his steely blue eyes cutting across the room, just in case anyone wanted to step forward and confess right then that, by golly, it was me all along. Avoiding his father's gaze, Adrian glanced up at Max, who was watching them from the quarantine. Hugh continued, But he's using our symbol and our name. I want to know his motives. If he's an enemy, I want to know who he's working with. If he's an ally, I want to know why he's not working with us. He turned to Adrian and flashed his signature Captain Chromium smile, and one that, even after all these years, still made Adrian feel like he was looking at a picture on a cereal box. Who knows? Maybe he'll be at the trials. Mr. Everhart, Miss Westwood? A woman in a white lab coat and sneakers made her way across the lobby, carrying a clipboard. May I have a moment? We finished our preliminary tests on the chemical solution that was inside that projectile dart. Hugh and Simon joined her and started heading back in the direction she'd come from. Adrian followed, pretending he'd been invited as the rest of the crowd dispersed. "We don't have a run yet on the physical casing of the projectile," said the woman, flipping a page on a clipboard. "But the solution was nearly identical to the poisons that have been traced as cyanide in the past." "Cyanide," said Hugh. "Leroy Flynn?" The woman nodded. "An anarchist," said Adrian. They paused and turned back, and all three seemed surprised that he was still there. Sighing, Hugh turned back to the technician. "Nothing on the gun yet?" She started to shake her head, but hesitated. This isn't confirmed, but it carried manufacturing marks similar to some we've apprehended from non-affiliated criminals. Black market, if I had to guess." "Could be a new dealer in the city," said Hugh, stroking his chin. "Or an old dealer," added Simon, "getting back into business." "Who cares where the gun came from?" said Adrian. "Cyanide made the poison, and we know he's an anarchist. But between him and the puppeteer, that's got to be who Nightmare is working for, or with." Simon shoved the edges of his cape back from his shoulders. "The anarchists have been inactive for 9 years. More likely the girl's just some prodigy miscreant trying to make a name for herself on the streets." "You don't know that," said Adrian. "What does it matter? They attacked us today, the puppeteer and Nightmare both. That has to be enough cause to go after the anarchists, even under the code authority." "It isn't enough to confirm that Nightmare really is one of them." Hugh smiled then. There was something so warm and kind about it that Adrian bristled, like his dad was trying to comfort him after a rough day at softball practice. "But maybe you're right. We'll send someone to investigate the anarchists, ask a few questions, see what they can find out." Adrian's left eyelid began to twitch. "Why not send me? Us? Oscar and Ruby were on the ground today. They know more about Nightmare than anyone at this point. Let my team go." "Your team is excellent at patrol work," said Simon. "But you're not investigators. We'll find someone with more experience to handle it." Adrian massaged his brow. I just wonder if another team is going to take this as seriously as they should. Nightmare showed herself to be a real threat today, and if the anarchists were involved, then we have to stop thinking of them as harmless tunnel rats. Even without Ace, they're still villains. We can't be sure what they're capable of. Hugh laughed. "You forgot who you're talking to, Sketch," he said, using Adrian's renegade name. Adrian couldn't tell if it was endearing or insulting. Let the anarchists try to reclaim power of the city. They would never stand a chance. With or without this Nightmare. We are still superheroes, you know. They turned and followed the woman into the elevator bank, and already Adrian could hear them moving on to other topics of council business, how they would reassure the people after today's attacks, and what to do about Winston Pratt, and how best to track down this alleged black market weapons distributor. Adrian watched them go, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He couldn't help but feel that Hugh Everhart was mistaken. They weren't superheroes anymore, not in the way they used to be. It wasn't because they were getting older or because they hadn't been out in the field so much since they'd assembled the council and left most of the crime fighting to the younger recruits. It was because they have rules now. Rules that they themselves had created, but kept their hands tied nonetheless. The solution seemed so simple to him, so obvious. They knew where the anarchists lived. Renegade teams raided their stronghold every few months to make sure they weren't harboring illegal weaponry, or building bombs, or concocting fatal poisons exactly like the one they found in the Dart. All they had to do was go there and demand that Nightmare be handed over. Instead, they were going to send in some team who would do what? Ask a few inane questions and politely apologize for taking up their time? The puppeteer and Cyanide were both anarchists who had been loyal to Ace from the start. The odds that Winston Pratt had been working alone today struck Adrian as unlikely, and the idea that Nightmare's usage of his balloon and the fact that her dart had Cyanide's poison on it might be coincidences seemed naive. If the anarchists were growing active again, recruiting new members, plotting against the council, this might be their best opportunity to stop them before they were allowed to get out of control, because they could not get out of control. Not again. 9 years had passed, and yet the world still bore too many scars from the rule of Ace Anarchy. Adrian wasn't sure they would be able to recover a second time.